The air hung heavy with salt and desperation as the rusted door of the Brunswick Pier auction house slammed shut behind Ruth Carver, trapping her inside a dimly lit world of shadows and whispers. A German shepherd lay sprawled on the cold concrete, his scarred body trembling under the flickering fluorescent lights, ribs jutting like jagged promises of pain. Ruth's heart pounded as a burly man in a stained cap loomed over the dog, his boot hovering inches from its skull, snarling, "Move, you worthless mutt!" The crowd jeered, their laughter a jagged blade slicing through the humid night. Ruth clutched her last $200, tips from a week of spilled coffee and forced smiles, knowing this moment could break her. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The auction house reeked of damp wood and motor oil, a cavernous relic perched on the edge of Brunswick, Georgia, where the coastal wind carried the faint tang of marsh and fish. It was a place where broken things came to be sold or forgotten, and tonight Ruth felt like she belonged among them. At 34, she wore her exhaustion like a second skin. Her diner uniform faded to a dull gray, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun that barely contained the strands clinging to her sweat-damp neck. She'd come here on a whim, drawn by a crumpled ad in the Brunswick News she'd found under a sticky diner table. Former military dog, aggressive, final auction before euthanasia. 6 lines of text that had made her hands shake with something she couldn't name. The German shepherd didn't move as the auctioneer, a wiry man with a cracked voice and tobacco-stained teeth, climbed onto a makeshift platform of splintered crates. "Starting bid, $50, he barked, his words echoing off the peeling walls. The crowd, a mix of fishermen, junk dealers, and the curious locals, erupted in mockery. "Not worth a dime," a gruff voice called from the front. "Damaged goods," another sneered, spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. Ruth's stomach twisted. She saw the dog's ears flatten slightly, a flicker of life in his dull brown eyes, and something inside her snapped, like the crack of a plate hitting the diner floor after a 12-hour shift. She wasn't alone in the back row. Mabel Grayson, the 70-year-old owner of Mabel's Diner, stood beside her, arms crossed over her faded floral apron. Mabel had come to bid on an old jukebox for the diner, her gray curls pinned tight against the coastal humidity. She glanced at Ruth, her sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Don't do something foolish, girl," she muttered, her voice rough but laced with a tenderness she rarely showed. Ruth didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on the dog, on the way. His scarred flank rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. He was a shell, hollowed out by horrors she couldn't yet fathom. But she recognized that emptiness. It was the same one that stared back at her in the cracked mirror of her mobile home every morning. Tommy Lee, the 19-year-old busboy from the diner, hovered nearby, his lanky frame shifting nervously. He'd tagged along to help Mabel carry whatever she bought, his fisherman's tan stark against his too-big t-shirt. "He looks mean," Tommy whispered, edging closer to Ruth, his sneakers squeaking on the damp floor. "Like he'd bite your hand off." Ruth ignored him, her fingers tightening around the wad of crumpled bills in her pocket. She didn't have a plan, barely had a life beyond pouring coffee and dodging leers at the diner. But something about this dog pulled at her. A thread tied to the father she'd lost to the Gulf War, to the stories he'd told of loyal dogs in the desert. The auctioneer's voice cut through her thoughts. $50, anyone? Last chance. before we send this sorry beast to the pound." More laughter rippled through the room, cruel and careless. Ruth's chest tightened. She saw the burly man nudge the dog with his boot again, harder this time, and the animal flinched. A subtle tensing of muscles, a flattening of ears. It was enough. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, her boots thudding against the concrete. "I'll take him," she said, her voice steady but haunted, cutting through the mockery like a lighthouse beam through fog. The room fell silent, every eye turning to her. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned, showing a gap where a tooth should have been. "Well, hell, we got a bidder. $50, going once, twice." He paused, scanning the crowd for a challenge, but no one spoke. Ruth's heart hammered as she walked forward, the bills damp in her shaking hand. She didn't look at Mabel, or Tommy, didn't dare meet the stares boring into her back. She knelt 6 feet from the dog, her knees pressing into the gritty floor, and softened her voice. "Hey, buddy, I'm Ruth. I'm not going to hurt you." His eyes flickered toward her, a brief flash of cognizance in their dull depths, and she held her breath, waiting. Behind her, Mabel sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "You're a damn fool, Ruth Carver," she said, but there was no venom in it. Tommy edged closer, peering over Ruth's shoulder. "What are you going to call him?" he asked, his curiosity overriding his earlier fear. Ruth didn't answer right away. She studied the dog's scars, jagged lines crisscrossing his flank, old wounds that spoke of something darker than battle. "Ranger," she said finally, the name slipping out like a memory she didn't know she had. "He's Ranger." The paperwork took 15 minutes. No questions, no background check, just a liability waiver. She signed without reading, and the $200 she pressed into the auctioneer's greasy palm. "He's all yours," he said, handing her a worn leather leash. "Though I'd get a muzzle. He's unpredictable." Ruth nodded, barely hearing him. She approached Ranger slowly, her boots echoing in the now quiet room. He didn't move, but she saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his muscles tensed, his ears pinned back. She'd seen that look before, in her father's eyes when he'd come home on leave, haunted by things he wouldn't say. She crouched again, keeping her distance. "We're gonna figure this out, you and me," she murmured, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. Ranger's gaze met hers, and for a moment she swore he understood. Not just her words, but the weight behind them. The crowd began to shuffle out, their interest fading, but Ruth stayed, rooted to the spot, tethered to this broken creature she'd claimed. Outside, the coastal wind howled, rattling the auction house's tin roof. Mabel waited by the door, her arms still crossed. "You got a place for that dog?" she asked, her tone gruff but practical. Ruth nodded, thinking of her cramped trailer near the marsh. "I'll make room." Mabel snorted. "Better hope he don't tear it apart. Or you." Tommy lingered, kicking at a loose board. "He's kinda cool, I guess," he said, then glanced at Ruth. "You sure about this?" She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. As they stepped into the night, Ruth felt a presence at the edge of her vision. A tall figure in a worn coat, watching from the pier's shadows. Colonel Edwin Pritchard, though she didn't know his name yet, stood motionless. His gray eyes fixed on Ranger. He'd recognized the dog the moment he'd seen him. A ghost from a past he'd tried to bury. But he said nothing, slipping into the darkness as Ruth led Ranger toward her beat-up Chevy. She didn't see him, didn't know the secrets he carried, but she felt the weight of something bigger than herself settling over her shoulders, a story just beginning to unfold. The salt-laden wind off Brunswick's marshlands rattled the tin walls of Ruth Carver's mobile home, a weathered box perched on cinder blocks where the world seemed to shrink to the hum of cicadas and the flicker of a single bulb. Inside, Ruth knelt on the threadbare carpet, her hands still trembling from the auction, watching the German shepherd she'd named Ranger huddle in the corner, his scarred body pressed against the peeling paneling, his breath shallow and uneven, as if the air itself might betray him. The trailer smelled of stale coffee and damp wood, a testament to her life of scraping by. 12-hour shifts at Mabel's diner, tips barely enough for rent, and memories of a father lost to war that clung like the marsh mud to her boots. Tonight, though, something new had invaded her sanctuary, a creature as broken as she was. Ruth set a chipped bowl of water near Ranger, keeping her distance. "You thirsty, buddy?" she asked, her voice soft but unsteady, the same tone she used with late-night diner stragglers too drunk to tip. His ears twitched, but he didn't move, didn't even glance at the bowl. His eyes, dulled by whatever horrors had carved those scars into his flank, stayed fixed on some unseen point beyond her. She recognized that stare. It was the one she'd seen in her father's face when he'd come home on leave from the Gulf War, a 1,000-yard gaze that carried deserts and death. She'd been 10 then, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the weight of his silence. The trailer's cramped space felt smaller with Ranger in it. Her bed, a sagging mattress on a rusted frame, took up half the room, flanked by a card table littered with unpaid bills and a photo of her dad in his army uniform, his grin wide under a sandy sky. She'd wanted to be a nurse once to heal people like him, but his death had buried that dream under medical debts and a mother who'd faded away soon after. Now, at 34, Ruth was just a waitress, her hands calloused from scrubbing plates, her heart hardened by years of keeping it closed. Yet here she was, staring at a dog she'd spent her last dime on, wondering what madness had possessed her. A sharp knock rattled the flimsy door, and Ranger's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Ruth flinched, her pulse quickening. "Easy, boy," she murmured, rising to peek through the crooked blinds. Tommy Lee stood outside, his lanky frame silhouetted against the sodium glow of the Marsh Road's lone street lamp. She opened the door a crack, the humid night air rushing in. "What are you doing here, Tommy?" she asked, her voice sharp with exhaustion. The 19-year-old busboy shifted on his feet, his fisherman's tan stark against an oversized t-shirt. "Mabel sent me," he said, holding up a dented tin bowl. "Said you'd need something for that dog to eat out of. She's worried you're in over your head." Ruth snorted, taking the bowl. "Tell her I'm fine." Tommy peered past her, eyes widening at Ranger's tense form. "He don't look fine. He's gonna bite somebody, Ruth." She sighed, stepping aside to let him in, though she regretted it the moment he tripped over the threshold, splashing water from the bowl onto the floor. Ranger lunged, a blur of fur and teeth, his growl escalating to a snarl. Ruth threw herself between them, arms outstretched. "Back off, Tommy!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The dog stopped short, his jaws inches from her leg, hot breath mingling with the scent of fear. Tommy stumbled back, hitting the wall with a thud. "Jesus, Ruth, he's crazy!" he yelped, his hands shaking. She glared at him, then softened her tone toward Ranger. "Hey, it's okay. It's just water. Nobody's hurting you." His ears flattened, and he retreated to his corner, trembling but silent. Tommy rubbed his arm, muttering, "You're nuts keepin' him." Ruth ignored him, kneeling to mop up the spill with a rag. "He's scared, not crazy," she said, more to herself than to him. She saw the way Ranger's muscles tensed, the way his eyes darted to every shadow, like her own nights waking from dreams of gunfire she'd never heard. Tommy lingered, curiosity winning over fear. "Why'd you even buy him? You ain't got the money or the space." Ruth paused, her rag dripping onto the floor. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something about him feels like he's mine to fix." Outside, the marsh whispered its restless song, and Ruth felt the weight of her choice settle deeper. She sent Tommy home with a curt, "Tell Mabel I'll be at work tomorrow," then turned back to Ranger. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a safe distance away, and started talking about her dad's stories of military dogs, about how he taught her to spot Orion in the Georgia sky. "You're a soldier too, ain't you?" she said, her voice breaking. "What did they do to you?" Ranger's head tilted slightly, a faint spark in his gaze, and she wondered if he heard more than just her words. The night stretched on, the bulb buzzing overhead, and Ruth stayed there, her back aching against the wall. She didn't sleep, couldn't, with Ranger's uneven breathing filling the silence. She didn't know how to care for a dog, let alone one this broken, but she'd figure it out. She had to. Because in that trailer, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, Ruth Carver felt something stir, a flicker of purpose she hadn't known since she'd buried her dreams with her father's flag. The morning sun crept over Brunswick's marshlands, painting the sky in streaks of gold and gray, but inside Ruth Carver's trailer, the air remained thick with the weight of the night before. Ranger hadn't moved from his corner, his scarred body curled tight against the wall, eyes half open and wary. Ruth stood at her tiny stove, the hiss of a cheap coffee pot mingling with the distant cry of gulls. Her hands shook as she poured a mug, the ache in her bones a reminder of hours spent on the floor, talking to a dog who wouldn't come near her. She'd called out sick from the diner, something she never did, but today she needed answers. She'd found the newspaper ad again, tucked under a stack of bills on her card table. The Brunswick News was a thin rag, mostly ads for shrimp boats and church suppers. But there it was, folded and smudged. Former military dog, aggressive, no training possible, final auction before euthanasia. 6 lines that had haunted her sleep, now staring back at her in black ink. Ruth traced the words with a chipped fingernail, her mind racing. Military dog, like the ones her dad had bragged about, the ones he'd said were braver than half his unit. She glanced at Ranger, his ribs stark against his dull coat, and felt a pang she couldn't name. The trailer door creaked open, and Tommy Lee barged in, his sneakers thudding on the floor. "Mabel's mad you ain't at work," he announced, then stopped short, eyeing Ranger. "He's still alive?" Ruth glared, setting her mug down with a clink. "He's fine. What are you doing here?" Tommy shrugged, fishing a crumpled pack of gum from his pocket. "Thought I'd check on you. Mabel said you're losing it over that dog." He popped a piece into his mouth, then, without asking, reached for Ruth's bag on the table, rummaging through it. "Hey!" Ruth snapped, lunging to grab it. Too late. A faded photo slipped from the bag, fluttering to the floor, an army snapshot of her father, grinning under a desert sun, his arm around a younger soldier. Tommy picked it up, squinting. "This your dad!" Ruth snatched it back, her voice sharp. "Don't touch that!" The memory hit her like a wave, her father's voice, rough with pride, telling her about the dogs that sniffed out bombs that saved lives. She clutched the photo, her throat tight, and turned to Ranger. "You were one of 'em, weren't you?" She needed to know more. Grabbing her keys, she told Tommy, "Stay here. Don't mess with him." He protested, but she was already out the door, the Chevy's engine sputtering to life. The drive to Lydia Harper's vet clinic took 10 minutes. The coastal road winding past shrimp boats and live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. Lydia, a wiry woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense braid, met her at the door. "Heard you got a dog last night," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's wrong with him?" "Everything," Ruth admitted, handing over the ad. Lydia's face darkened as she read it, then motioned Ruth inside. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur, a stark contrast to the marsh's wildness. She led Ruth to an exam room where Ranger's fate began to unravel. "Bring him in tomorrow," Lydia said. "But I can tell you now, those scars ain't from combat. They're too precise, too deliberate. Somebody hurt him bad, and not just once." Ruth's stomach churned. Who'd do that to a military dog? Lydia hesitated, her gaze distant. "Folks who don't see 'em as heroes, just tools. I've seen it before, with strays from Kings Bay." The nearby naval base loomed in Ruth's mind, a place her dad had mentioned in passing. She pressed, "Can you find out more?" Lydia nodded. "I've got a contact who might pull his records. Give me a day." Back at the trailer, Ruth found Tommy sprawled on her mattress, flipping through a fishing magazine he'd dug up. Ranger hadn't budged, but his eyes tracked her as she entered. "You're a pain, Tommy Lee," she muttered, shoving the photo back into her bag. He grinned, oblivious. "Saw that old guy from the auction hanging around the diner today. Looked at your truck funny." Ruth froze. Colonel Ed Pritchard, she didn't know his name yet, had been a shadow at the pier, his gray eyes locked on Ranger. "What did he look like?" she asked, her voice low. Tommy shrugged. "Tall, old, kinda creepy, like he knew something." That night Ruth sat with Ranger, the coffee cold in her mug. She pulled out her dad's photo, tracing his face. "You'd know what to do," she whispered. Ranger's ears twitched and she started talking. About the desert stories, about the dogs he'd loved. They're supposed to retire with honor, not end up like this. His head tilted, a faint spark in his gaze, and she felt a connection, fragile but real. Outside, the marsh rustled, and she wondered about the man Tommy had seen, about the secrets he might carry, and the truth she was starting to chase. The sky over Brunswick darkened as a summer storm rolled in from the Atlantic, its first rumble shaking the marshlands like a warning shot. Inside Ruth Carver's trailer, the air grew heavy with the scent of rain and tension, the single bulb flickering as thunder growled closer. Ranger paced near the door, his scarred body taut, ears pinned back against the rising wind rattling the tin walls. Ruth stood at the card table, her hands gripping a chipped mug, the coffee inside long gone cold. She'd spent the day wrestling with the questions Lydia Harper had planted. Who hurt him? Why? And now as the storm bore down, she felt the weight of her choice to save this dog pressing harder than ever. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating Ranger's tense form through the crooked blinds. Ruth set the mug down, her voice soft but firm. "Easy, boy. It's just a storm." He didn't hear her, or didn't care. His pacing quickening, claws clicking in the worn linoleum. She'd seen him flinch at sudden noises before, the clatter of a dropped tray at the diner or Tommy Lee's careless stumbles, But this was different. His eyes, usually dull with resignation, now darted wildly, searching for an enemy she couldn't see. Another crack of thunder split the air, and Ranger bolted, crashing into the chain-link fence she'd rigged outside to keep him safe. The metal buckled, and a yelp escaped him as blood streaked his shoulder. Ruth grabbed her raincoat, a tattered thing she'd patched with duct tape, and flung the door open, the wind snatching it from her grip. Rain pelted her face as she stumbled into the yard, the marsh grass whipping at her legs. "Ranger!" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the storm. He thrashed against the fence, his paws digging into the mud, the blood mixing with rain in dark rivulets. She dropped to her knees beside him, 6 feet away, her hands outstretched but not touching. "Hey, buddy, it's me. I'm here." Lightning flashed again, and she saw it. The terror in his eyes, the same raw panic she'd felt as a kid hiding from 4th of July fireworks, her father's absence a gaping wound. The storm raged, rain soaking through her coat, plastering her auburn hair to her face. She didn't move, didn't try to grab him. Instead, she sat back in the mud, her voice trembling but steady. "I know what loud noises do to you," she said, the words spilling out like a confession. "My dad. He'd wake up screaming sometimes like the war followed him home. I'd hide under my bed scared of the sounds I didn't even hear." Ranger's thrashing slowed, his head turning slightly toward her. She kept talking, rain dripping from her chin. "You're not alone in this, okay? We'll wait it out together." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The storm blurred time into a haze of wind and water. Ruth's legs cramped, her back ached, but she stayed, her voice a lifeline through the chaos. "We're safe here," she murmured over and over until the thunder softened to a distant rumble. Ranger stopped fighting the fence, his body slumping into the mud, his breathing ragged but calmer. He didn't come closer, didn't touch her, but he took a tentative step forward, then another, stopping just beyond her reach. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something shift, a flicker of trust, fragile as a marsh reed in the wind. Headlights pierced the rain, and Mabel Grayson's old pickup screeched to a halt at the edge of the yard. The diner owner climbed out, her gray curls plastered under a plastic hood, a blanket clutched in her gnarled hands. "Get inside, you idiot!" she barked, her voice cutting through the fading storm. She stomped toward Ruth, her boots sinking into the mud, and thrust the blanket at her. "You'll catch your death out here." Ruth took it, shivering, but didn't move. "He's scared, Mabel. I can't leave him." Mabel's sharp eyes flicked to Ranger, then softened. "Lord help you, girl," she muttered, lingering a moment longer before retreating to her truck. "Don't stay out here all night." The rain dwindled to a drizzle, the sky bruising purple as the storm moved inland. Ruth wrapped the blanket around herself, her gaze locked on Ranger. "That's it, buddy," she whispered, a tear mixing with the rain on her cheek. "You're doing good." He didn't come closer, but he stayed there, watching her, his ears relaxing slightly. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet, but it was a start, a crack in the wall between them. As the marsh settled into silence, Ruth felt a quiet resolve take root. She'd face whatever came next, storm or not, because Ranger wasn't just a dog anymore. He was hers to protect. The morning after the storm dawned sticky and still, the marshlands outside Ruth Carver's trailer glistening with leftover rain. Inside, the air hung heavy with dampness and the faint metallic tang of Ranger's bloodied shoulder. He'd retreated to his corner again, licking the shallow wound, his eyes half closed but alert. Ruth stood at her card table, the newspaper ad spread before her, its ink smudged from her restless fingers. Lydia Harper's words from the vet clinic echoed in her mind. Somebody hurt him bad. And now, with the storm's chaos behind her, Ruth felt a fire kindling inside, a need to know who'd broken this dog she'd fought to save. She'd called Lydia at first light, her voice hoarse from the night's vigil. "Can you meet me at the diner?" she'd asked, and the vet had agreed, promising to bring whatever she'd dug up. Ruth pulled on a clean uniform, still wrinkled from the laundry pile, and coaxed Ranger into the Chevy with a piece of stale bread. He moved stiffly, his shoulder raw, but followed her, keeping his distance in the truck bed. The drive to Mabel's diner was quiet, the coastal road lined with live oaks dripping moss, the air thick with the promise of heat. The diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd, fishermen nursing coffee, retirees swapping gossip, but Ruth felt every eye on her as she led Ranger through the back door. Mabel stood behind the counter, her apron stained with grease, her gray curls pinned tight. "You look like hell," she said, sliding a mug toward Ruth. "And that dog's a mess." Ruth managed a tired smile. "He'll be okay. Lydia's coming." Mabel grunted, her gaze flicking to Ranger, who'd settled under a table, his ears twitching at every clatter. Lydia arrived 10 minutes later, a manila envelope tucked under her arm. She slid into a booth across from Ruth, her braids swinging as she leaned forward. "Got his records, or what's left of 'em," she said, her voice low. She opened the envelope, spreading papers marked with faded military stamps. "His real name's Rex, served 3 tours in Afghanistan, highly decorated. Last deployment matches your dad's unit. 1991, Gulf War spillover." Ruth's breath caught, her fingers tightening on her mug. "My dad?" Lydia nodded, pointing to a redacted line. "Can't see the handler's name, but the dates line up. He was with the Army, right?" Ruth nodded, her mind racing. Her father's stories flooded back, dogs sniffing out mines, saving squads from ambushes. She glanced at Ranger, his scarred flank rising with each breath. What happened to him after? Lydia's face darkened. "Records stopped 6 months ago. He disappears, then shows up at that auction. Something's wrong here, Ruth." The diner door swung open and Colonel Edwin Pritchard stepped inside, his worn coat brushing the floor. He froze, his gray eyes locking on Ranger. Ruth saw it, the recognition, the flicker of something heavy, and her pulse quickened. He muttered, "Shouldn't be here," and turned to leave. But Tommy Lee, wiping tables nearby, piped up. "Hey, that's the guy from the auction!" Ruth stood, her voice sharp. "Wait!" Ed didn't stop, disappearing into the morning haze, but his reaction lingered like a storm cloud. Tommy dropped his rag, sidling over. "He was watching your truck yesterday, too," he said, chewing gum loudly. "Creepy old man." Ruth glared at him, then turned to Lydia. "What did they do to him?" Lydia hesitated, then pulled out a photo from the envelope. A grainy shot of Rex in a kennel, ribs stark, eyes hollow. "These scars, shock collars, beatings. Military dogs don't end up like this unless someone wants them gone." Ruth's stomach twisted. "Who?" Before Lydia could answer, Mabel leaned over the counter, her voice rough. "My boy served under a Major Harrison in Vietnam. Wrote me about a trainer who'd break dogs to prove a point. Never forgot that name." Ruth's heart thudded. Harrison. She'd seen it in her dad's last letter, a scribbled note about a bastard pushing the dogs too hard. She knelt beside Ranger, her hand hovering near his head. "You knew my dad, didn't you?" His eyes flickered, a spark of something alive, and she felt it, a thread tying her past to his. That night back at the trailer, Ruth sat with Ranger, her dad's photo in her lap. "You're a hero," she whispered, tears welling, "and they tried to erase you." His head tilted, ears perked, and she knew she couldn't stop now. Outside, the marsh whispered, and Colonel Ed watched from the shadows, his silence a secret waiting to break. The marshlands outside Ruth Carver's trailer shimmered under a gibbous moon, the air thick with the hum of crickets and the faint tang of salt. Inside, the single bulb cast long shadows across the peeling walls, illuminating Ranger's scarred form curled in his corner. Ruth sat cross-legged on the floor, her father's photo clutched in one hand, a cold mug of coffee in the other. The name, Major Harrison, whispered by Mabel at the diner, burned in her mind like a coal, stoking a fire she couldn't quench. She'd seen it before, scrawled in her dad's last letter, a warning about a man who broke more than just rules. Now, as Ranger's eyes flickered toward her, she felt the weight of their shared past pressing closer, demanding answers. Ruth set the mug down, her gaze tracing Ranger's matted fur. "You knew him, didn't you?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harrison." Ranger's ears twitched, a low whine escaping his throat, and she leaned closer, her heart thudding. Something glinted beneath the thick fur of his neck, a metallic edge, half hidden by scars. She reached out, then stopped, remembering his snarls at sudden moves. "I need to see," she said more to herself than to him, and grabbed her phone to call Lydia Harper. The vet arrived 20 minutes later, her truck kicking up gravel on the marsh road. Lydia stepped inside, her braids swinging, a medical bag slung over her shoulder. "You sounded spooked," she said, eyeing Ranger. Ruth pointed to his neck. There's something there. Metal, I think. Can you check it? Lydia knelt beside her, peering at the glint. Could be a tag, she said, her voice low, but he won't like this. She pulled on gloves, her movements slow, deliberate. Talk to him, Ruth. Keep him calm. Ruth nodded, scooting closer. Hey, buddy, she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. It's just us. You're safe. Ranger's eyes locked on hers, his body tensing as Lydia's hand neared his neck. The vet's fingers brushed his fur, parting it to reveal a rusted military tag embedded in his skin, the edges crusted with old blood. Ranger lunged, teeth bared, a snarl ripping through the trailer. Ruth threw herself forward, her arms shielding Lydia. No, Ranger, she shouted, her voice cracking. He froze, jaws inches from her face, his hot breath mingling with her fear. For a moment, time held still. Then he backed off, trembling, retreating to his corner. Lydia exhaled, her hands shaking. Jesus, Ruth, he'd trust you more than I thought. Ruth stayed on her knees, her pulse racing. He's scared. Whatever that is, it's part of what they did to him. Lydia nodded, pulling a small flashlight from her bag. Let me try again. Keep talking. Ruth swallowed, her voice softening. You're okay, buddy. We're going to figure this out together. Ranger's ears flattened, but he stayed still as Lydia worked, her fingers probing the tag. It's in deep, she muttered. Grown over, like they left it there to rot. After tense minutes, Lydia extracted the tag with a pair of tweezers, a faint whimper escaping Ranger as blood welled up. She held it under the light, squinting at the worn engraving. Handler, Major James Harrison. Ruth's breath caught, her father's letter flashing in her mind. Harrison's the bastard, pushing the dogs too hard. She took the tag, its cold weight searing her palm. This is proof, she said, her voice hardening. He did this to you. Ranger's eyes met hers, a spark of recognition flaring, and she felt their bond tighten, a shared wound, a shared fight. Lydia cleaned Ranger's neck, her hands gentle but firm. This ain't just abuse, she said. It's systematic. Military dogs don't end up with tags like this unless someone's hiding something. Ruth clutched the tag, her resolve steeling. I need to know more. Lydia nodded. I'll call my contact again, see if they can dig deeper. But Ruth, this can get ugly. Ruth didn't flinch. It already is. Outside, headlights flashed through the blinds, then faded, a car idling too long on the marsh road. Ruth's stomach twisted, but she said nothing, her focus on Ranger. She sat with him that night, the tag beside her, whispering promises into the dark. We'll make this right, she said, tears stinging her eyes. For you. For my dad. Ranger's head rested on his paws, his breathing steadying, and she knew they were in this together now, a step closer to the truth, and to whatever danger waited beyond the marsh. The night after the tag's discovery hung heavy over Brunswick, the marshlands cloaked in a fog that swallowed the moon and muffled the cricket's song. Ruth Carver sat on her trailer's sagging steps, the rusted tag in her pocket pressing against her thigh like a silent accusation. Ranger lay nearby, his scarred shoulder bandaged from Lydia's work, his eyes tracking the shadows beyond the chain-link fence. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, but beneath it lingered a tension Ruth couldn't shake. Headlights in the dark, a name from her father's past, and a dog who'd survived horrors she was only beginning to grasp. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with Harrison's name and the tag's grim story. The trailer's bulb buzzed faintly inside, casting a weak glow through the open door, but she stayed outside, needing the marsh's restless hum to steady her. Ranger's ears perked suddenly, a low growl rumbling from his chest, and Ruth's head snapped up. Headlights pierced the fog, two black SUVs rolling slowly down the marsh road, their engines a quiet purr. They stopped 50 yards away, idling, their tinted windows reflecting the night like empty eyes. Ruth stood, her heart pounding, and stepped closer to Ranger. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her hand hovering near his head. The lead SUV's door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, his polished shoes sinking into the mud. He was tall, his face shadowed under a fedora, his voice smooth but cold. "Ruth Carver," he called, his tone too familiar for a stranger. She stiffened, her fingers brushing Ranger's fur. A first touch he didn't resist. "Who's askin'?" she shot back, her voice sharper than she felt. The man approached, stopping just beyond the fence, his hands in his pockets. "I represent Major Harrison," he said, his smile thin. "That dog's his property. Hand him over, and we'll leave quiet-like." Ranger's growl deepened, his body tensing, and Ruth stepped in front of him, her fists clenching. "He's mine," she snapped. "Bought him fair at the auction. You got no claim." The man chuckled, a sound that chilled her spine. "You don't know what you're a-holdin', lady. That dog's a liability, dangerous. Major wants him back." Behind the fence, a rustle caught Ruth's ear. Tommy Lee crouched in the marsh grass, his phone raised, snapping photos. The boy's clumsiness betrayed him. A twig snapped, and the man's head whipped around. "Who's there?" he barked, his hand slipping under his jacket. Ruth's pulse raced. "Nobody," she lied, stepping forward to block his view. "Just the wind. Now get off my land." The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move, his gaze shifting to Ranger. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dropping. "This ain't over." Ranger surged forward, teeth bared, his growl a warning that shook the night. The man flinched, stepping back, and Ruth grabbed the fence, her voice fierce. "He stays with me. Tell Harrison he's done hurtin' him." The man smirked, retreating to the SUV. "You'll regret this," he said, slamming the door. The vehicles peeled away, their taillights fading into the fog, but Ruth's chest tightened. A threat lingered in their wake. Tommy stumbled from the grass, his phone clutched tight. "Got pictures," he panted, his eyes wide. "They looked mean, Ruth." She glared at him. "What the hell you doing here?" He shrugged, sheepish. "Heard you talking to Lydia at the diner, figured something was up." She sighed, too rattled to scold him. "Keep those photos safe," she said. "Might need 'em." Back inside, Ruth locked the door, her hands shaking as she sank onto the mattress. Ranger stayed by the steps, his ears pricked, guarding her. She pulled the tag from her pocket, its edges biting her skin. "They're comin' for you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I won't let 'em." Ranger's eyes met hers, steady and fierce, and she felt his strength bolster her own. Across town, Colonel Ed Pritchard sat in his darkened shack, a whiskey glass in hand, staring at an old photo of his unit, Harrison among them. He'd seen the SUVs from his window, heard Ruth's defiance through the marsh's stillness. His silence was cracking, and he knew he couldn't hide much longer, not from her, not from the past. The dawn broke over Brunswick with a sluggish heat, the marshland steaming under a sky streaked with pink and gray. Ruth Carver sat at her card table, the rusted tag from Ranger's neck glinting beside her cold coffee, its engraving. Handler, Major James Harrison. A silent taunt. Ranger lay near the trailer door, his bandaged shoulder rising with each breath, his eyes fixed on the fog beyond the blinds. The visit from Harrison's men the night before lingered like a bruise, their threat echoing in the quiet. "This ain't over," Ruth's hands trembled as she traced the tag, her resolve hardening. She needed more than a name to fight back, and she needed it now. She'd called Lydia Harper at first light, her voice tight with urgency. "Those men, they're coming for him. We need help." Lydia had promised to dig deeper, but Ruth couldn't wait. She grabbed her father's photo from the table, his grin a lifeline, and whispered to Ranger, "We're not alone in this." His ears twitched, a faint spark in his gaze, and she felt their bond steady her. The trailer's tin walls creaked as she stood, her mind racing. Harrison's shadow loomed larger, but there had to be someone else who knew his crimes. A knock rattled the door, softer than the night before, and Ruth tensed, her hand brushing Ranger's fur. She peered through the blinds, then exhaled. Ellen Hayes stood outside, a petite woman in her 50s, her graying hair pulled into a bun, a thick envelope clutched in her hands. Ruth had met her once. Years ago, at a veterans memorial, Ellen's husband had served with her dad. She opened the door, the humid air rushing in. "Ellen? What are you doing here?" Ellen's eyes, red-rimmed but fierce, met hers. "Heard about your dog at the diner. I think I've got something you need." Inside, Ellen spread the envelope's contents across the table. Yellowed letters, a journal, photos of soldiers and dogs in desert sand. "My husband Tom was a lieutenant in your dad's unit," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He wrote about a dog, Rex, that saved him from an ambush in '91. Said it broke free, warned the squad, took a bullet for him." Ruth's breath caught, her gaze flicking to Ranger. "That's him!" she whispered, recognizing the scars in a grainy photo Ellen slid forward. Ellen nodded. "Tom thought so too. Kept track of him till Harrison got hold of him." Ruth sank into a chair, the journal open before her. Tom's handwriting detailed Harrison's enhanced training. Shock collars, starvation, beatings to break defiance. "He wanted control," Ellen said, her voice breaking. "Rex wouldn't bend, so Harrison marked him for elimination. Said he was unstable. Tom was gathering evidence, but he died before he could finish." Ruth's fingers tightened on the page, her father's warnings echoing. "Harrison's a bastard, pushing the dogs too hard." "They're covering it up," she said, her voice hard. "And they're coming for Ranger to finish it." The trailer door creaked, and Colonel Ed Pritchard stepped inside, his worn coat brushing the floor. Ruth started, but Ellen's presence steadied her. Ed's gray eyes locked on Ranger, then the journal. "You're stirring a hornet's nest," he said, his voice rough with years of whiskey and regret. Ruth stood, her chin lifting. "You knew him, Harrison. Why didn't you say something?" Ed's jaw tightened. "I trained with him years back. Saw what he did to dogs, good ones like yours. Quit when I couldn't stomach it, but I know where he'll be. Kings Bay, next week. Big demonstration for the brass." Ruth's pulse quickened. "We can stop him there." Ed hesitated, then nodded. "I'll help. Owe it to the dogs I couldn't save." Ellen gathered the papers, her resolve matching Ruth's. "Tom would want this. We'll show him what Harrison's done." Ranger rose, his stance firm, and Ruth felt a surge of purpose. Her team was forming, fragile but fierce. Tommy Lee burst in, his sneakers skidding on the linoleum, phone in hand. "Got those pictures from last night," he panted, then froze at the crowded room. Ruth glared. "You're gonna get yourself hurt, sneaking around." He grinned, oblivious, dropping the journal as he fumbled with his phone. Ellen snatched it up, her eyes blazing. "Careful, boy." Ruth sighed, but the photos, blurry shots of the suited man, added weight to their case. "We've got proof," she said, her voice steadying. "Now we plan." That night Ruth sat with Ranger, the journal beside her. "You're a hero," she whispered, tears falling. "We'll make 'em see." His head rested near her knee, a first, and she knew they were ready for the fight ahead with allies she hadn't expected and a past demanding justice. The sun blazed over Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base, its glare bouncing off the concrete sprawl near Brunswick, where military brass and private contractors gathered for Major Harrison's demonstration. Ruth Carver stood at the edge of the crowd, her diner uniform swapped for a borrowed jacket, her heart pounding beneath the weight of Ellen's journal in her bag. Ranger pressed against her leg, his bandaged shoulder hidden under a tactical vest Ed had scavenged, his eyes sharp despite the memories this place might hold. They'd slipped in with Ed's old credentials, a gamble that could end them, but Ruth felt the fire of her father's legacy and Ranger's burning too bright to turn back. The base hummed with anticipation, a stage set up near the kennels, flags snapping in the coastal breeze. Ellen moved through the crowd, posing as a journalist, her camera hiding a recorder. Lydia waited in her truck outside, ready to signal if trouble came. Ed lingered near Ruth, his gray eyes scanning the perimeter. "Harrison's here," he muttered, nodding toward a tall figure in a tailored suit stepping onto the stage. Harrison, his silver hair gleaming, his smile polished but cold. Ruth's grip tightened on Ranger's leash. "Let's do this." Harrison's voice boomed over the speakers, smooth and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you'll see the future of tactical canine training. Discipline, precision, results." The crowd murmured approval, but Ruth saw Ranger's ears flatten, his body tensing at the sound. She knelt beside him, whispering, "We've got 'em, buddy." Ed pointed to the kennels behind the stage. "They're moving dogs out, covering tracks." Ruth's stomach twisted. Harrison was erasing evidence, just as he'd tried with Ranger. Ellen worked fast, slipping copies of Tom's journal pages to key officers, her voice low but firm. "Read this. See what he's really done." Lydia's voice crackled through Ruth's earpiece. "Security's tightening up. Hurry." Ruth nodded to Ed, and they moved toward the kennels, Ranger leading, his stride purposeful. Two handlers loaded a sedated German shepherd into a van, their faces blank with routine. Ruth stepped forward, her voice ringing with borrowed authority. "Stand down. Federal investigation in progress." The handlers froze, one lowering a tranquilizer gun, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Harrison rounded the corner, his security detail flanking him, his smile faltering at the sight of Ranger. "Well, Walker," he said, recovering with a sneer, "I wondered when you'd show." Though I expected something more dramatic from a waitress with a mutt. Ruth's jaw clenched. "No dramatics, Major. Just the truth about the dogs you've broken, the lives you've buried." Ranger stepped forward, sitting tall, his military bearing a silent rebuke to Harrison's words. The younger handler blinked, peering at him. "Wait, is that Rex? They said he was put down." The crowd shifted, whispers spreading as Ellen's evidence circulated. Harrison's voice hardened. "That dog's unstable. Watch." He pulled a high-frequency whistle from his pocket, its piercing sound slicing the air. A tool of torment Ruth recognized from Tom's notes. Ranger's ears flattened, but he didn't flinch. His gaze locked on Ruth, waiting. "He's not your weapon anymore," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. He's a soldier, and he's chosen his side. Ed barked at the handlers. Check his ID. See what Harrison did to him. The younger one hesitated, then stepped back, doubt creasing his face. Sir, what are we doing with these dogs? Harrison snapped. They're military assets. My program. My rules. But the tide was turning. Officers approached, pages in hand, their faces grim. Ellen's recorder caught Harrison's snarl, and Lydia signaled from the truck. Military police are coming. Hold on. Ranger lunged, not at Harrison, but at the van, nudging the sedated dog free. The crowd gasped as he guided it to safety, he movements precise, compassionate. Ruth's voice rose. That's what he's capable of. Savior, not killer. Harrison's facade cracked, his hand twitching toward a concealed weapon, but Ed stepped in, his voice low. It's over, James. Sirens wailed and military police swarmed the scene, cuffing Harrison as he spat. You'll pay for this, Carver. Ruth knelt beside Ranger, her hand on his head. You showed him, she whispered, tears falling. The base buzzed with chaos, but she felt a quiet victory. They'd exposed Harrison, and Ranger had reclaimed his honor. Ellen and Ed flanked her, their fight just beginning, but for now they'd won. The twilight sky over Brunswick glowed an angry orange, the marshlands reflecting flickers of flame from the Kings Bay kennels where Ruth Carver stood, her breath ragged with smoke and fear. Hours after Harrison's arrest, chaos had erupted. A fire, deliberate and fierce, roared through the base's canine facility, its crackling roar drowning out the distant wail of sirens. Ranger pressed against her leg, his tactical vest singed, his eyes wild but focused as shouts echoed around them. Ruth clutched Ellen Hayes's journal, its edges curling from the heat, her mind racing. Someone was erasing the last of Harrison's secrets, and the dogs trapped inside were paying the price. The demonstration's triumph had shattered moments after the military police hauled Harrison away. Ruth, Ellen, Ed, and Lydia had lingered, ensuring the sedated dogs were safe, when a muffled explosion rocked the kennels. Black smoke billowed and handlers scattered, their shouts lost in the blaze. "It's a cover-up!" Ed bellowed, his gray eyes scanning the chaos. "Harrison's men, they're torching it!" Ruth's stomach twisted. She'd seen the SUVs lurking near the base earlier, their menace now unleashed. Lydia's voice crackled through her earpiece, frantic from her truck. "Fire department's 10 minutes out! Too late!" Ruth spun toward the kennels, the heat stinging her face. Through the smoke she glimpsed 2 young German shepherds, sedated and helpless, slumped in a burning cage. "We can't wait!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. Ranger surged forward, his training kicking in, but she grabbed his vest. "Not yet!" Ed's hand clamped her shoulder, his voice rough. "You'll die in there, girl!" She shook him off, her eyes locked on Ranger's. "He knows how to do this. We've got to try." Ellen stepped up, her face pale but resolute. "I'll help. Tom'd never forgive me if I didn't." They moved as a unit, Ruth, Ranger, and Ellen, dodging falling beams, the air thick with ash. Ed stayed back, yelling for stragglers to clear the area. Inside the kennels were a furnace, the roar of flames swallowing Ruth's calls. Ranger darted ahead, his nose low, guiding them through the haze to the trapped dogs. Ruth coughed, her lungs burning, as she and Ellen pried at the cage's warped bars. "Come on," she grunted, her hands blistering. The dogs stirred, their whimpers faint, and Ranger nudged them, his strength a quiet command. The cage gave way, and Ellen dragged one dog free, her arms trembling. Ruth pulled the second, its fur hot against her skin, but a beam crashed down, splitting the path behind them. Flames surged, cutting Ranger off. "No!" Ruth screamed, dropping the dog as Ellen hauled it toward the exit. Ranger turned, his eyes meeting hers through the fire, a silent understanding passing between them. He bolted back into the smoke, searching for a way out, his form vanishing as the roof groaned above. Ellen yanked Ruth toward safety, her voice sharp. "He'll make it. Move." They stumbled into the night, the rescue dogs coughing beside them, handlers rushing to help. Ruth collapsed in the mud, her gaze fixed on the inferno. "Ranger!" she shouted, her voice breaking. Ed knelt beside her, his hand firm on her arm. "He's a soldier. He knows how to survive." But the fire roared louder, and Ruth's chest heaved with sobs. She couldn't lose him. Not after everything. Mabel Grayson's pickup screeched up, the diner owner leaping out with blankets and a jug of water. "Lord Almighty!" she barked, tossing a blanket over Ruth. "What's that fool dog done now?" Ruth didn't answer, her eyes locked on the kennels. The community rallied, fishermen, retirees, even Tommy Lee with his phone, dousing the edges with buckets from the marsh. Then a crash split the air. The rear wall buckled and Ranger burst through, his coat singed, his legs buckling as he hit the ground. Ruth ran to him, dropping to her knees, her hands hovering over his trembling form. "You're okay," she gasped, tears streaking her soot-streaked face. Lydia raced over, her medical bag open, her voice urgent. "Smoke inhalation's bad. Burns on his side. We need a clinic now." Ruth cradled Ranger's head, his eyes dim but fixed on her. "Don't you dare give up," she whispered, her voice fierce. "We've come too far." The fire trucks arrived, too late to save the kennels, but in time to witness Ranger's sacrifice, and Ruth's unbreakable bond with him. The fluorescent lights of Brunswick Veterinary Clinic buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the waiting room where Ruth Carver sat, her hands stained with soot and trembling with exhaustion. Ranger lay beyond the glass doors, his powerful frame now fragile under tubes and monitors, fighting for life after the fire at Kings Bay. The clock ticked past midnight, each second a hammer against Ruth's heart. She'd followed Lydia's truck here, the ride a blur of sirens and prayers, and now she waited, her raincoat draped over her shoulders, the weight of the night pressing her into the cracked vinyl chair. Ellen Hayes sat beside her, silent but steady, her gray bun unraveling from the chaos. Ed leaned against the wall, his worn coat unbuttoned, his gray eyes distant but watchful. Mabel bustled in, her arms full of coffee, thermoses and diner rolls, her voice gruff but kind. "You ain't eaten enough to keep a bird alive," she said, shoving a roll into Ruth's hands. Ruth took it, her fingers numb but didn't eat. Her gaze stayed on the doors, willing Ranger to hold on. Lydia emerged, her braid frayed, her face etched with fatigue. "He's fightin' hard," she said, her voice professional but soft. "Next 24 hours are critical. Smoke's torn his lungs up, and the burns are deep. Best care we've got, though." Ruth nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stood, pressing her hand against the glass, and whispered, "You're my family, buddy. Don't leave me." Ranger's tail twitched faintly through the window, a sign, small but alive, and her tears fell, hot against her cold skin. The waiting room filled as Brunswick rallied. Tommy Lee arrived, his sneakers squeaking, leading a group of fishermen with blankets and cash from a quick collection. "Folks heard what he did," he said, dropping coins into a jar. "They're calling him a hero." Mabel organized the chaos, her diner instincts kicking in, while Ellen draped Tom's old service flag over Ruth's shoulders. The gesture broke her, memories of her dad's funeral crashing in, and she wept openly, her voice raw. "I failed him, Ellen. Should have stopped him from going in." Ed stepped forward, his hand firm on her shoulder. "You didn't fail. He chose to save him, like your dad would have. That's what soldiers do." Ruth shook her head, her sobs ragged. "I can't lose him, too." The night stretched, the community filtering through, retirees with prayers, veterans with quiet nods, their presence a testament to Ranger's reach. Lydia found Ruth alone at dawn, staring through the glass. "He's fightin' to get back to you," she said, touching her arm. "You gave him that." The sun rose, casting gold over the clinic, when Ranger's vitals dipped. The emergency team rushed in, and Ruth watched, helpless, as they battled to save him. Every memory flooded back, the auction, the storm, their quiet nights, and she pressed her forehead to the glass. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're supposed to heal together." Outside, Brunswick transformed the parking lot into a vigil. Candles flickering, voices murmuring, Tommy leading a prayer, Mabel pouring coffee, Ed guarding the door. Then a shift. Ranger's tail thumped weakly, his eyes cracking open, finding Ruth's. Lydia burst out, tears in her eyes. "He's stabilizing, he's coming back." Ruth sank to her knees, relief flooding her, and the room erupted in quiet cheers. She pressed her hand to the glass, whispering, "You're enough, buddy." The road ahead was long, but Ranger wouldn't walk it alone. Brunswick had claimed him, and Ruth had found her purpose in his fight. The autumn sun dipped low over Brunswick, Georgia, casting a golden sheen across the marshlands where Ruth Carver's trailer once stood alone. 2 years after the fire at Kings Bay, the land had transformed into the low-country canine haven, a sprawling sanctuary of weathered barns and quiet fields, its fences humming with the soft barks of healing dogs. Ruth stood on the porch of a modest cabin she'd built with community hands, her auburn hair streaked with gray, her hands rough but steady as she watched Ranger guide a new arrival, a skittish Belgian Malinois, across the grass. His muzzle was silvered now, his steps slower from the burns and smoke that had nearly claimed him, but his eyes burned with a quiet dignity that spoke of battles won. The haven was a testament to their survival. After Ranger's recovery at the Brunswick Vet Clinic, Ruth had turned her grief and grit into purpose. Harrison's trial had ended in conviction. His empire of cruelty dismantled by Ellen's evidence, Ed's testimony, and the photos Tommy Lee had snapped that foggy night. The Ranger Protocol now governed military canine programs nationwide. Independent oversight, humane training, guaranteed retirement, born from their fight. Ruth had sold her trailer, pooled donations from Brunswick, and bought this land, vowing to give every broken dog a second chance, just as Ranger had given her. Inside the cabin, Ellen Hayes sorted files at a desk, her gray bun neat again, her role as outreach coordinator a tribute to her husband Tom's unfinished work. "Got a letter from the Pentagon," she called, her voice steady. "They're funding 5 more centers like ours." Ruth stepped inside, a faint smile tugging her lips. "Tom'd be proud," she said, her gaze drifting to a framed photo of her father beside Tom's, a pair of soldiers, their dogs at their sides forever linked by Ranger's courage. Ranger nosed the Malinois toward a water bowl, his patience a balm to its trembling. Ruth watched, her heart swelling. He'd become the haven's heart, a guide for dogs and veterans alike. The barn, Rebuilt from Kings Bay's ashes, housed a training center where Ed Pritchard now mentored ex-soldiers, his gravelly voice softer as he taught them to heal alongside their canine partners. "He's got your dad's spirit," Ed said, limping over with his cane, his gray eyes crinkling. "Never backs down." Ruth nodded, her throat tight. "He's more than that. He's ours." Mabel Grayson shuffled up the path, her apron swapped for a sweater, her diner days behind her, but her presence a constant. She carried a tin of biscuits, her voice gruff. "Folks in town won't stop talking about this place. You're making Brunswick proud, girl." Ruth took the tin, her smile widening. "Couldn't have done it without you." Mabel snorted, but her eyes softened as she watched Ranger. "That dog's a miracle. Ought to be in a book." Tommy Lee bounded in, his lanky frame filling out, his fisherman's tan traded for scrubs. He'd started vet tech training under Lydia Harper, who'd turned her clinic into the Haven's medical hub. "Got the new kennels ready," he announced, then knelt by Ranger, scratching his ears. "You're the boss, huh?" Ranger's tail thumped, a rare ease in his stance, and Ruth saw the boy he'd been, clumsy, curious, grow into someone she trusted. The day unfolded with quiet purpose. Veterans arrived with their dogs, their faces etched with scars like Rangers, finding solace in the Haven's rhythm. Ruth led a session, her voice calm but firm, teaching a former Marine to sit with his shepherd, to listen rather than command. Ranger joined them, his presence a bridge, and the Marine's shoulders relaxed, a tear slipping free. "He gets me," the man whispered, and Ruth nodded, her own eyes misting. "That's what he does." As dusk settled, Ruth and Ranger walked the perimeter, the marsh whispering its familiar song. A young veteran struggled with a new therapy dog near the fence, his hands shaking, his voice sharp with frustration. Ruth paused, but Ranger moved without prompt, his silvered muzzle nudging the dog closer, his calm radiating. The veteran watched, then sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. "I thought I couldn't do this," he said, his voice muffled. Ruth knelt beside him, her hand light on his shoulder. "You can, with him. Ranger showed me that." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Ranger's, and nodded. A silent pact formed. Ruth stood, her chest tight with pride, and led Ranger back to the porch. They sat as the sky deepened to purple, the Haven's lights glowing like stars against the marsh. She pulled the rusted tag from her pocket, its edges worn smooth from years of touch, and traced. Major James Harrison, a name now powerless, its shadow lifted by their fight. "We healed together, didn't we?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Ranger rested his head on her knee, a gesture he'd mastered since the fire, and she felt his warmth anchor her. A letter arrived that evening, slipped under the door by a neighbor. Words from a veteran in Virginia, healed at the Haven a year ago. "You and Ranger gave me hope when I had none," it read. "I'm alive because of you." Ruth pressed it to her chest, tears falling, and looked at Ranger. "You're enough," she said, her voice steady now. He'd saved her, just as she'd saved him, their wounds a map to this moment. The community gathered that night, an impromptu vigil under the live oaks, candles flickering, voices soft. Mabel poured coffee, Tommy shared stories of Ranger's heroics, Ed stood guard, and Ellen read Tom's last journal entry aloud. "Some courage can't be measured. Rex showed us that." Ruth listened, her hand on Ranger's head, and felt her father's presence in the breeze, his pride in their legacy. As the stars pierced the sky, Ruth and Ranger sat alone on the porch, the Haven quiet behind them. The once broken dog from the auction house had become a healer, his scars a testament to resilience, her own a mirror of his. Together they'd turned pain into purpose, proving that loyalty and love could mend the deepest wounds. She leaned against him, whispering, "We changed the world, buddy," and his tail thumped, a rhythm of peace. Brunswick's lights glowed in the distance, a town forever marked by their story, a legacy of valor, born from a waitress and her warrior, enduring beyond the marsh. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.